So for those of you screening, you're not really getting into that nitty gritty. You're not looking for, the type of hearing loss, the degree of hearing loss, or the configuration. What you're doing is you're really just presenting at one presentation level across specific screening frequencies, just to kind of determine who might be at risk of having a hearing loss. Once that screening is completed, if there are children that are being referred, that's when that threshold seeking diagnostic evaluation is going to occur to determine all those things we already discussed. Whether the hearing loss is in one ear or both, what the type, degree, and configuration are, and what sort of follow-up is recommended by the audiologist. So as I mentioned before, cochlear implants, hearing aids, maybe it's a conductive hearing loss and we're going to refer them to the ear, nose, and throat physician to see if there's any medical management that's possible to resolve the hearing loss, or determine instead that they're a hearing aid candidate. So when you're doing a hearing screening, there are a lot of different factors that can come into play. So thinking about the noise level in the test environment, this is really the biggest one for me. If it's a noisy test environment, you're really going to struggle to get an accurate picture of whether or not they're hearing your screening tone. And we'll talk a bit more about how to combat that later. The cooperation of the child is a really big component. If you have an unwilling child, you're not going to get very far in your screening. So we'll talk a bit about that as well, of how to get a child on board with you. Big thing, if there's a sensory neural hearing loss, hopefully they're not going to pass your screening. That's kind of the goal, right? Of making sure you're setting up an accurate screening protocol. In a lot of cases, schools will sort of excuse those children that have a documented hearing loss from the screening, because we know we're not going to really get any extra information from that process. The other piece, though, is a conductive hearing loss. So they might not have a documented hearing loss, but they've got some fluid, they've got a lot of earwax, some cerumen impaction, or maybe they have another disorder of the middle ear that hasn't been diagnosed before. So those are the types of things that we might pick up most frequently on these school hearing screenings. And again, it could be something totally transient that can be resolved through the PCP or an ENT. Or maybe it's something more significant that requires a little more investigation. But really, that's the goal of the screening, to pick these kids out and then let them go on for the next level of diagnostic testing and follow-up. So some screening requirements. I pulled some of this from chapter 45, and then some of it just kind of from my own brain, but a calibrated audiometer. So they should be calibrated annually by a professional who specializes in that. And chapter 45 also indicates that it should be a type 4 audiometer. All that means is that it's been developed, created specifically for hearing screening purposes. And versus, you don't need a diagnostic audiometer, for example. If you have one, it's probably fine, but at minimum, it should be a type 4. You need a quiet environment, trained personnel, and of course, that willing child. So our screening protocol, again, from chapter 45, says that the screening frequencies should be at 1,000, 2,000, and 4,000 hertz. That's the minimum requirement. Chapter 45 also says that 500 hertz can be included in your screening protocol. And the reason why it's not a requirement and why you're given a little bit of flexibility on an individual basis is because 500 hertz is the frequency that's most often impacted by background noise, ambient noise in the test environment. So we'll talk about how to determine whether or not to add 500 hertz in a moment. You're going to screen at each of these frequencies in each ear, and your presentation level will be 25 dB HL. So you've decided today's your screening day and you're trying to set up for the day. What do? You're going to want to perform a biologic check. So that means that you're going to you're going to find someone, either yourself or a colleague that you know has normal hearing, and you're going to run the screening on them. You're doing that to make sure that they can hear the screening, the presentation level that's been selected, that 25 dB tone at each of your screening frequencies in the environment you're in. If they can't, that probably tells you you're going to need to either pick a new environment or adjust things in the environment to reduce the background noise. So if there's fans on, the HVAC's really loud, you're next to the music room, maybe, I don't know. Being flexible to adjust is important. You're going to perform, once you have that child in front of you, a pure tone sweep. at 1,000, 2,000, and 4,000 hertz. So what that means is you're setting your decibel dial to 25 and you're leaving it alone. And then you're going to move right through those screening frequencies and look for a response. For me, I always feel most comfortable if a child responds at least twice reliably before I want to move on to the next frequency. But really, you're supposed to present at least one time and no more than 4 times to elicit a response. If the child, for whatever reason, did not respond at any single frequency in either ear, so they could have done great, but at 1,000 hertz in the right ear, they didn't respond, that still constitutes a failure to the screening. And you're going to want to follow your follow-up protocol from there. So I've talked a lot about ambient noise, so I don't want to sort of belabor that point. I put these numbers up here not because I'm expecting you to go back to your screening environments and figure out at what level the ambient noise is at 2,000 hertz and whether or not it's below 58. That's not even something I do, but the sort of way to do that informally is to do that biologic check that, that I recommended previously. Again, finding someone with no normal hearing, giving them the screening and making sure it's audible to them so that you know it's likely to be audible to the children you're screening, assuming they have normal hearing. Don't be afraid to get a little bit creative if you're screening a younger child. We do something in audiology called play audiometry. Basically, instead of having the child raise their hand every time they hear the beep, because that's incredibly boring, especially for the younger crowd, making a little game of it. You can get as creative and fancy with this as you want, but honestly, dropping a ball in a bucket or stacking blocks on each other every time you hear the tone, that might be enough just to get them engaged and get them through the screening process. I'm contradicting myself here just for a minute. And the reason for that is I sometimes find, especially again with younger children, using a conditioning tone can be really helpful. And what I mean by that is if you have a child that, especially one-on-one, you get the impression that they're able to understand you pretty well, but they're not responding at all to your screening. So you're thinking maybe they're just not understanding. Of course, you can re-instruct them, but also if you want to pop the decibel dial up to about 50, make that tone just a bit louder. 50 decibels is about where average speech is. So putting the tone there and presenting again, just so they hear, oh, okay, that's the sound I'm listening for, and explain you're listening for that, but now it's going to be really quiet. I think that can sort of give them enough information to say, okay, I know what I'm doing. I understand the task. And in most cases, you're going to be able to get the kids through the screening process using that. Another factor to consider when you're scheduling your screenings throughout the year. What is the impact of otitis media? You're going to have a lot of children, especially in those elementary ages, that have some middle ear fluid happening. Sometimes it's, an infection, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just sitting there and, no one's really picking up on it until you do a screening. So there's some benefit of having the screening so that you do pick up on it. However, if you choose to hold your screenings through the winter months, you're more likely to have, an elevated number of referrals for kiddos that maybe it's just, fluid there for a week and then it's gone. You're more likely to hone in on your chronic otitis media kiddos if you are screening them during the fall or the spring. So looking at the referral protocol, in Chapter 45, they recommend that if you have a child that fails for any reason, take the headphones off, re-instruct them, and then re-screen them immediately, right away the same day. If they continue to fail the screening, you're going to want to schedule them again in about 2 to 4 weeks for an additional screening. If they then fail the rescreen, that's when you're going to want to refer them to their parents and provide the parents with some sort of referral form that they're going to bring to their primary care health provider. So then the PCP is going to make a determination. Sometimes PCPs will just administer another screening right there in the office, or they're going to make that referral to an audiologist for a diagnostic evaluation. As school nurses, you're going to be responsible for then following up with the parents or keeping tabs on the process and determining whether they brought their child for that follow-up evaluation, and then determining what the outcome is. Really, you're kind of on the front line of, if a child is truly diagnosed with a communication between the family and the school, just determining what sort of accommodations and services they might need in the school to support their access to the educational environment.